welcome back. So we're at the tail end of the month, and that means we're about to get refined news. Probably within the next couple of days, could even be next reset, but I think it'll probably be around the time the voting gauntlet comes out, or maybe a bit after, or whenever we get the legendary banner. Usually it correlates a bit before the next seasonal banner, and the next seasonal banner is on the 7th, I believe, of September. So give or take maybe a few days, we're going to get refined news. But a lot of people are also expecting that the CYL4 units are going to get refined in that batch. And it made me wonder, if for some chance any of these units got a bad refine, would they basically be unusable, or they really wouldn't be worth using? I thought it would basically make for a fun, hypothetical theory video, whatever the case may be. I don't necessarily think it's theory, but whatever the case may be, I found the topic to be interesting and I wanted to give my thoughts on it. So we may as well just talk about the 4 Brave units from CYL4, talk about some what-if scenarios, and just give a general opinion as to whether or not they could still be worthwhile even with a bad refine. So, with that being the case, we may as well just get started with Brave Edelgard. Brave Edelgard definitely aged the best, I would say, comparatively, mainly because she's an armor, and that she does have access to the likes of saves, and her min-max stat line is definitely really beneficial in that regard. She has 45 attack, which is really high, 43 defense, which is really good, and 35 res, which isn't even bad by any means. She also has 46 HP, which is pretty good, and then her dump stat obviously being 16 speed. As her weapon currently stands, it's a slaying axe that grants extra movement and the orders effect. And if she has more than 25% of her HP present, then she inflicts -6 attack and defense on the foe during combat, thus bolstering her overall damage output and tanking capabilities even more. And for what it's worth, it's still not a bad weapon per se. I would definitely say the former half of it, minus the slaying, didn't really age as well, mainly because armors are definitely more stationed to the ground. They don't really move as much. And it could be really nice for those like semi-moments where you kind of just have to get her moving around. But in my opinion, the presence of save skills just kind of neuter that effect, especially for her since she is an armor. But even with that being the case, it could still be quite convenient. Now, I forgot to preface this at the beginning of the video, but more than likely, they're going to keep whatever effect they already have or get it upgraded and then have like an additional 1 or 2 things here and there depending. So if we were to just assume how they are right now, with base kit and all, honestly, she could make for a really solid near save unit. So even if you were to just keep her PRF, she could still run Steady Breath with Sturdy Stance 3 and near save, and then retaliate with Bonfire on every single hit, provided that there aren't any guard effects, which is really nice, just for getting damage output and tanking in general. She really shouldn't struggle to take physical hits, but in my opinion, the release of Stout Axe means that even if her refine ends up being really bad for some reason, she'll still have a competent weapon to work with, because Stout Axe combined with her PRFB skill, Black Eagle Rule, means that she gets damage reduction on every single hit against most foes that generally don't neutralize the damage reduction in the enemy phase, which is extremely good. So for anyone who's aware of Brave Ike who just gets damage reduction for existing, this is basically the equivalent. You have Stout Axe, which grants 50% damage reduction on the first hit if the foe can double, and given her speed set, they'll more than likely double as is. And then you combine that with Black Eagle Rule that grants 80% damage reduction on every second hit, then she's always getting damage reduction, which is really strong. And you could basically do the same thing as before. You stack up her attack and defense and aim for potential 1-round KOs if possible, but even if she doesn't kill, she's more than likely not going down. And as I stated earlier, I do think she is probably the best aged CYL4 unit that we have currently. And even if she were to get a really bad refine, I can still see her being used to a significant degree. Next we have Brave Dimitri, who has a distant counter weapon with the Mistletoe effect. That's really all it does. It's definitely shown its age. Even when it came out, it was fine, but it was definitely more so carried by his PRFB, which is still really good even to this day. And I'll go into that in a second. In terms of his stat line, he has a lot of attack at base 40, workable speed at 36, really good defense at 40, and his dump stat definitely being his res, which is a bit weird, mainly because of the fact that he has a distant counter weapon, so naturally he would want to counter all types of units, and a lot of ranged threats tend to be magical based. So even with damage reduction, he still has 19 res, so if he were to get doubled or braved, he would pretty much die or lose so much of his health to the point where he would probably be taken out in the next combat. But even with that being the case, he still has a lot of options available to him because he is a lance unit. So in terms of just hits he can use right now, he can either go down the speedy route of stacking up piercing tribute with speed skills like joint drive speed and darting breath, or he could further bolster his physical bulk by going down the courtly candle stout lance route while also simultaneously stacking up his attack and defense, so that way he could pretty much just become a physical wall. And it does help with blue line roll because it does work off his defense, as he not only gets damage reduction based on his defense, but he also gets a guaranteed follow-up if he has more defense than the foe, which is really, really nice. In terms of practicality right now, I find that Brave Dimitri is much better as a melee specialist than pretty much a distant counter unit because he doesn't have the res stat for it. And even with the damage reduction, he can still get brute forced like crazy, especially nowadays as units are just hitting absurd amounts of attack. But even with that being the case, I find that if it weren't for blue line rule, Dimitri would probably be one of the worst CYL4 units that we have right now. But in my opinion, even with Moon Gradigu being really mediocre at the moment, Piercing Tribute and Courtly Candle do help quite a bit. And for what it's worth, I would definitely say he's the second best current CYL4 unit. I'm hoping he gets a good refine, but even if he were to get a bad refine, I can still see him getting some usage because Blue Line Rule is a really, really good beat passive. But he would definitely have a lot more competition given that you have near saves who just supersede the melee specialist role, but you could also just run other lance infantries with damage reduction, and while they may not have as much physical bulk as he would, they can still maintain a good amount of their health because damage reduction reduces it by a great amount. Next we have Brave Claude, who honestly has a decent weapon for what it is, but I think the reliance on having to trigger his special to actually get any semblance of bulk is what's currently holding him back, especially without any sort of damage reduction properties, as units are just hitting way harder nowadays, which makes it a lot more difficult for units like Brave Claude to just eat a singular hit and then retaliate back and heal back whatever they can, if possible. I remember Fatal Smoke being a big thing for a while, and it's not as big nowadays because we have so many more threats like Dual Crom, but even with that being the case, he just doesn't really have good mixed bulk in general, even with his PRF in tow. That's only 28 defense and 30 res, and units are just hitting way too hard nowadays for it to even matter. Which is why I don't think he's as good as the other two previously mentioned units, but he's not as bad, in my opinion, as Lysithea currently, and I'll get into her in a bit, mainly because he also has access to the likes of White Capo, which is really, really good. In terms of his offensive prowess, he also has 3640 attack speed, which is also really nice. Can't really complain there. But yeah, as I just mentioned, White Capo exists, which actually gives him a suitable player phase niche. Granted, it gives every bow unit that has speed a really good player phase niche, but at least for Brave Claude, he can function a lot better in the player phase because even with the lack of notable B slot options, he could still run the likes of Wind Sweep, Catch, Rain, and Blade Session, so as he's continuously stacking attack and speed, he could still double and prevent any sort of counterattack from any sort of foe that targets his defense, minus exceptions that have Null C Disrupt, whether in their weapon or B slot, but even with that being the case, most foes will not be able to counterattack. However, in terms of just other options, he really doesn't have much else, unfortunately, because there just aren't any B slots for ranged flyers, which is a big problem. It's also part of the reason why he's not as good as he probably could be, because Intelligent System just decides to not release any sort of skill. Trace does not count, in my opinion. It's too strict, but we have it on here because it's still stats. So you can still make him into an enemy phase unit that pretty much just prioritizes melee foes, and that's probably where his second best option comes into play, mainly because he could subsidize his bow weakness by just focusing on melee foes, and his weapon does work if he is within 2 spaces of an ally, and given that guard effects are definitely more enemy phase prominent, he can still reliably trigger his specials, especially since he has Slang, so his sustainability will be pretty good. You could also replace his C skill for Speed Smoke 4 if you want damage reduction properties, but it will take a bit of setup. Even then, he still gets damage reduction, which isn't bad whatsoever. That being said though, if he did get a bad refine, while he wouldn't necessarily be unusable, I find that the competition would not really favor him, mainly because we also have other ranged flyers that are easily accessible and mergeable, such as Summer Alencia, who may not have as good of a stat line, but the stat lines aren't really too different, and considering she's just really easy to merge, I find that the trade-off isn't really going to be that bad, especially since you can just save orbs. But I'm really hoping Brave Claude can get a good refine whenever that comes out. And then finally, we have Brave Lysithea, who in my opinion definitely needs to refine the most. She has cavalry effectiveness, which isn't really great. Most cavs aren't really known for their bulk, and enemy face cavs in general don't really have a niche or prominent spot in the meta right now, mainly because they don't have the B slots for it. And the ones that do function in the enemy phase generally have a guaranteed follow-up built into their weapon anyway, so I don't find it's really going to be as compelling as an effect as it otherwise maybe armor effectiveness would be, but nevertheless, it also grants speed +3, and it also has 2 checks based on the foe's HP and her own HP. If the foe's HP is 75% or more, she gets 6 attack and speed during combat, and if her HP is below 100%, then she gets a guaranteed follow-up and the desperation effect, which is really nice when you can set it up. And in my opinion, that's just where the fault lies. It's the setup. In terms of her just overall stat line though, she has really, really good defenses of 40, 39 attack speed, which is really nice. Her bulk is also non-existent at 21, 25 defense res, so anything that basically sneezes on her is probably going to one-shot. But even with that being the case, if you can set up the weapon, it'll do pretty well in general. But again, having to set it up is definitely holding her back quite a bit. But even with that being the case, there really aren't any notable inheritable red tomes worth giving her in comparison, because most of the inheritable weapons don't really work with her general stat line, and the ones that do are just strictly worse than what she already has. So until we get something a lot more competitive, there's no reason to really replace her PRF whatsoever. If you just want to use her right out of the gate, you can still use her with Flashing Blade, Blade Session, and her 2 cooldown special, so she's always getting a 2 cooldown special right off the bat. Really, really easy. Again, she will need to set up, but if you just bring a support like Winter Bernadetta, it's not as bad, but that does come at an opportunity cost, which does suck. But even with that being the case, you can still do it. And then there's really not much else she really can do besides just player face stuff. So I figured just give her a Blazing Wind set. She can do really, really well in terms of PvE because she does have a lot of attack and speed, but also the Desperation and guaranteed follow-up effect, meaning that she's always going to double before the foe can counterattack, which is really, really convenient, which is why I do think a Blazing Wind set could actually do her quite well. Granted, you will need to set it up with the likes of maybe Valoria, Grim Raphael, and it will be a bit tougher because she doesn't have slaying, but if you could get the Blazing Wind going, then I can absolutely see this working out really, really well. But even with that being the case, I find that Brave Lysithea, compared to the other 3, definitely needs to refine the most. Even if it's as basic as just the chip damage at the start of turn 1 or whatever the case may be, similar to the likes of Winter Bernadetta, I think that would be great. But I would also like to see other effects in tow because we just have so many notable red tomes in the game currently that just strictly outperform her in the player phase and can actually function in the enemy phase when needed to. As such, I definitely believe that she's definitely the worst off at the moment. And if she were to get a bad refine, then I don't think anyone would ever use her, unless it was for PvE. And just to go over the final rankings real quick, I have Edelgard in 1st, Brave Dimitri in 2nd, Brave Claude in 3rd, and Brave Lysithea in 4th. But for what it's worth, if the former 2 didn't have their PRFB skills, I don't think they'd be as high. Well, Edelgard would probably still be 1, because armor's pretty much cheap, but Brave Dimitri probably would have been somewhere else. But it's really, really hard to say because they're also built around those B slots, so anything could have really changed outside of that. But even with that being the case, I really hope that all these units get really good refines, and if it is next month, then all we could really do is hope. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the discussion video thingy-majiggy, whatever you want to call it. I'm hopeful that Intelligent Systems isn't really going to screw them over. Brave Dimitri is going to need a bit more help because he has a distant counter weapon, but time will tell, basically. In any case, who are you really hoping that gets a really good refine? Are you hoping all of them get good refines? Which one are you really excited for the most? Let me know down below. And until next time, I'll see you later.